Hey, everybody. So, this week we're going to be talking about wakefulness and sleep, and basically some of the rhythms that our body creates to have a regular sleep and wake and sleep schedule, basically. So, let's get started. So, this is a quote from our text. The body spontaneously generates its own rhythm of wakefulness and sleep. So I think that some people probably think that because of certain stimuli in our surroundings, that that's what is generating our sleep and wake cycles. But our text highlights that that's actually an internal mechanism. So our body is actually generating this sleep wake rhythm or cycle. And that's what we're going to mainly focus on today. So, as far as rhythms go, the text that we're reading from gives a couple of examples. The endogenous circannual rhythm. So, that's the rhythm that is generated from within to prepare for seasonal changes. So, if you think about other mammals, just think about the examples that come to mind when you think about that. I know I think about birds. You see birds kind of getting stuff for their nests, and then I know where I live, at certain times of the year, you'll see just these huge amounts of blackbirds just in the yard because they're kind of traveling, to move for the season. So you think about birds traveling, and then you can also think about some other animals, storing food, getting ready to hibernate for the cold seasons. So that's an example of the endogenous circannual rhythm. And then we've got the endogenous circadian rhythm. And I know for me, when I hear that word circadian, that's when I think more of, kind of human beings and our natural rhythms that we have. And so typically you think about us as human beings, our circadian rhythms, you think about that 24-hour span. There's 24 hours in a day. And so we have this kind of 24-hour daily rhythm. And it's not just in regards to sleep wake. We have these circadian rhythms that are connected to other things as well: eating, drinking, elimination, urination, hormone, metabolism, sensitivity to drugs, body temperature. So basically, there's a lot of things going on that, are kind of in a rhythm throughout the day. So if you think of the times that you eat, the times that you might feel different, or the times you might have more energy, that's all sort of related to this concept of circadian rhythm. And that's something that our body generates. So now let's talk about the mechanisms behind this concept of rhythms, circadian rhythms, or just in general rhythms that are in charge of the sleep-wake cycles. Okay, so the suprachiasmatic nucleus is a structure in our brain that is basically kind of like the main driver, the driver's seat, so to speak, for our sleep cycles, and then also body temperature. Okay, and that piece of the brain is actually part of the hypothalamus, which you may remember from some of our basic structural anatomy lectures. So if this part of the brain, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, becomes damaged, our body's rhythms become erratic. Okay, so what evidence do we have that this part of the brain, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, what evidence do we have that that is actually related to circadian rhythms? Well, the reason we know that is based on research, and research has shown, mainly in animals, our text talks about this research done with hamsters, for example, that when this SCN, when we transplant cells that produce the circadian rhythms of activity, even if they're kept in the same cell culture, if they're isolated from the rest of the body, and then transplanted into, another donor animal, then that circadian rhythm actually follows to the donor animal. So for example, if one hamster has a certain kind of rhythm and that brain matter is transplanted to another hamster, then that hamster is basically going to have the same circadian rhythm. So the evidence of research supports that this part of the brain is actually important. Okay, so retinohypothalamic path, that's related to the SCN as well. And it's related to light. Okay, so we know that light can play a role in sort of how we are, sort of how we know to be sleepy when it gets dark, for example. So light plays a part in this circadian rhythm concept. And so light can reset the suprachiasmatic nucleus through a small branch of basically a small branch of the optic nerve, which is this retinohypothalamic path. So through this branch in the optic nerve, light that comes in through that path can kind of reset the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So this particular path in the optic nerve is a little bit different than other parts of the optic nerve. And it's different in the sense that it's got some different types of cells that are responsive to light. So the retinohypothalamic path is that special path, and it has a special population of ganglion cells that have their own photopigment called melanopsin. Unlike the ones found in rods and cones, these special types of ganglion cells receive input from rods and cones, but even if they don't receive the input from rods and cones, they can respond directly to light. So it's this special pathway that basically can reset that suprachiasmatic nucleus. And the suprachiasmatic nucleus is also playing a factor in other parts of the brain. So it's actually controlling or having some kind of control over other parts of the brain. And what is particularly important when we talk about that is that it has some control over the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is what's basically driving melatonin levels. Okay, I know that many of you watching this right now have probably heard of melatonin. It's often used by people and even prescribed for children to use to help them fall asleep. So melatonin is a widespread chemical, and it's found in nearly all animals. Sponges, if you think about sea sponges, they are the only known exception that wouldn't have melatonin the way we think about other animals having melatonin, as well as plants and bacteria also have melatonin. So melatonin secretion starts to increase about 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. So when you take a melatonin pill in the evening, it actually has little effect on sleepiness because the pineal gland produces melatonin at that time anyway. However, people who take melatonin earlier, they might become sleepy earlier. So in this process, it shifts the circadian rhythm so that the person starts to become sleepier earlier than usual the next day. And melatonin has also been found helpful for people who travel. And in just a moment, we're going to go over some extra concepts that our chapter covered. And so we're going to talk about jet lag and stuff. But basically, when people travel and they have a difficult time falling asleep because they're used to a different time zone, a different circadian, their circadian rhythm is kind of off balance because they're in a different environment. People can use melatonin to basically help with that. Okay. And then the last piece on here, as far as the mechanisms, the actual physical mechanisms related to our circadian rhythms, is the biochemistry piece that was covered in our chapter. And based on some studies with fruit flies, it was found that two different genes are actually related to our sleep, wake and sleep and wake rhythms. So we've got the period gene and the timeless gene. The period gene is related to the PER protein, and then the timeless gene is related to the TIM protein. And these two proteins have been shown to be important with sleep-wake cycles. So the concentration of those two proteins promote sleep and inactivity. So if we've got higher levels of concentration of those two, there's going to be more of that sleepiness and inactivity. So how do these two genes, in other words, these two proteins, PER, TIM, how do they relate to sleepiness in fruit flies? Well, the proteins remain low during most of the day and then begin to increase towards the evening. So that would be consistent with a circadian rhythm, right? And so how does that apply to us as human beings? Well, animal research has shown that has often been helpful in helping us understand what's going on with us as human beings. Okay, so let's come back to some other concepts related to setting and resetting of circadian rhythms. I'm going to try not to botch this, but Zeitgeber, I believe is how it's pronounced. I actually had to Google that and listen to other people say it first. So Zeitgeber is the stimulus that resets circadian rhythms. And it's a German word that actually means time giver. So that's basically referring to the environmental cues that might help set our circadian rhythms in a way as far as environmentally. So the length of daylight, the degree of temperature around you, those are the types of things that might help regulate your circadian rhythms, or your biological clock, in other words. So what Zeitgeber or environmental cue do you think would be most important for human beings in general on average? The answer to that, according to our text, would be light. So when the sun is shining, the sun, it's daylight, your rhythm is probably gonna, think it's waking time, and then, in the evening when the sun goes down, you'd be more likely to be sleepy. So light is by far the most common or the dominant Zeitgeber for land animals. What about for blind people who aren't able to see or maybe sense light in the same way that people who have vision? Well, our text highlights that noise, temperature, meals, activities, that those can all be Zeitgebers for people who are blind, but more than half of people who are blind actually report having sleep problems. So it's not helpful, those Zeitgebers for people who are blind. For marine animals, tides can be an important factor there. So the way the ocean is moving, the tides, and other types of Zeitgebers that can actually play a factor here are exercise or activity, arousal, meals, and again, the temperature of the environment. I think most of us have probably heard of this concept here, jet lag. So jet lag is basically a disruption in the circadian rhythm due to some kind of travel, especially when you're crossing multiple time zones. It's kind of disrupt your circadian rhythm because those Zeitgebers are going to change. So when it's one time in your hometown, it's going to be a different time, in 2 time zones away or 2 or 3 more time zones away. So it's going to disrupt that, what you're used to as far as circadian rhythm. Shift work is referencing basically people who might have odd schedules, or people who work the night shift, or there's some people who have jobs where they're, think about like a doctor who might be on call after hours, and so they're going in late at night for a crisis, and then they're having to come in the next morning too, maybe. So shift work can also disrupt circadian rhythms, and so that can just kind of basically disrupt a normal general circadian rhythm. So And then you've also got this concept of AM versus PM people. So kind of people who call themselves morning people and people who are more like night owls. So there's some differences there as well. And some people just kind of naturally awaken early and reach their peak earlier in the day. And then some people just kind of become alert during the nighttime. And so that can depend on some different factors here. So it can depend on age. It can also depend on genetics and environment. And technology can also play a factor here too, because if somebody is maybe not looking at electronics or screens all day, you know, they're more likely to maybe just kind of get tired after sunset and, you know, have that kind of sleep cycle. Whereas somebody who's maybe looking at their phone in the evening or playing video games or, you know, just something that kind of is active and engaging, you know, their sleep cycle may differ for them. So that's one of the things that our textbook highlighted, is that, you know, technology and electricity can play a part in our circadian rhythms as well. And also the difference between being like a morning person or a more evening person. Okay, so that's about it for this lecture on sleep-wake cycles and just, you know, sleep and wakefulness in general. And please let me know if you have any questions. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.